There are actually different kinds of theism. I'll discuss about three kinds of theism. So one kind of theism is this what has been called anthropomorphism. So this type of theism is this idea that what people call God is almost like a superhuman type of entity. This is the idea of God as the old man with the white beard. This is sort of like the idea of the Greek gods of Mount Olympus, right? Zeus and Hercules and Ares and Aphrodite. Like if you think about it, the Greek gods, they're more like superhuman entities. They exist. The Greek gods, they exist within the natural world. They intervene in the natural world, but they really exist in the world. Um, and even somebody like Superman could count as this sort of thing. You have a clip, a scene here, a picture where in Star Trek Five, the crew of the Starship Enterprise encounters a being on a planet, and some people on the ship believe it's God, and he actually looks like an old man, and so on. And there's this funny line where this being, who claims to be God, says he wants their starship, and Captain Kirk says, what does God need with a starship? And that's sort of how they figure out that they're not really talking to God, because what would God need with a starship? So anyway, anthropomorphism is one kind of theism. Another kind of theism, which is quite popular today, is what one philosopher of religion named Brian Davies calls theistic personalism. Theistic personalism is this idea where God is an immaterial, a spiritual mind, a consciousness of some sort, who is a person. So God is this sort of spiritual person who has likes and dislikes, who interacts with the world in real time. Okay, so that would mean that this type of God is sort of somewhat exists within time and space. He may be immaterial, but he interacts with time and space, sort of like we do. He is the sort of designer, the creator and the designer of this universe from the outside. Uh, this type of theism, the God of this theism, he has personal qualities, power, knowledge, goodness, omniscience, and so on. And human beings interact with this God in real time. So this type of God literally spoke to Moses, literally spoke to Prophet Muhammad, and others. And there are a number of modern Christian intellectuals quite successful in their field: Alvin Plantinga, Richard Swinburne, William Lane Craig, many modern Protestant thinkers, and some classical Sunni Muslim thinkers who see God in this way, right? So theistic personalism, God as an immaterial, personal entity, a mind or consciousness, who interacts, who creates and interacts with the universe in real time. God is here a person, an immaterial person. So that's theistic personalism. Finally, there is a third type of theism, which Brian Davies calls classical theism. Now, in classical theism, God is not really defined as a person or a personal being, with wants and likes and dislikes, personal preferences. That is not how God is defined. In classical theism, um, instead of being so, I'll just backtrack a bit. In theistic personalism, the second one, God is sort of seen as the supreme being among everything else, right? The highest being among other beings. But in classical theism, it's not like that. In classical theism, God is defined or described as the absolute reality, the absolute, transcendent, immaterial, utterly timeless, unconditioned reality. And in classical theism, God does not exist in space and time. God creates space and time, but he is not part of space time. He does not interact with the world in real time. In classical theism, God has no parts, so he doesn't have a whole set of personal attributes, sort of like the way we do. He doesn't have likes and dislikes or any of these things. In classical theism, what creation means is that everything that exists depends on God. Whereas in theistic personalism, many versions of it, God created at some time in the past, and then God is not creating anymore unless he sort of chooses to intervene. In classical theism, it's not like that. In classical theism, everything depends on God at every moment. You could say that creation is continuous. There's no such thing as divine intervention, because in classical theism, the world could never exist apart from God's continuous creation anyway. And there's a lot of theologies and philosophers throughout history who've been classical theists. I've given some of the names, but this classical theism seems to be somewhat transcultural. It's in the Greek, the Indian, the Islamic, and the Christian traditions, right? It has its representatives and the Jewish traditions too. So it's quite widespread. So just to depict this for you visually here, I've tried to do this depiction. So on one hand, you have theistic personalism, which is also creationism is sort of part of that. Even deism would be the part of that. And in theistic personalism, God is like a demiurge. He's a personal being. He created the world, and then he will intervene in the world. In classical theism, it's more like this. The world, the cosmos, real existence is, you could say it's sort of surrounded by God, not in a material way, but in an ontological way. In classical theism, God is not just the supreme being. God is being itself. God is absolute reality in classical theism, and the cosmos is conditioned reality. So that's the difference between these two types of theism. Another way to talk about this difference is the idea of God versus gods. So David Bentley Hart tells us that one reason why there's so much misunderstanding on this topic of the existence of God is simply because many people, atheists and theists, are in the habit of conceiving God simply as some very large object or agency within the universe, or perhaps alongside the universe, a being among other beings who differs from other beings in magnitude, power, and duration, but not ontologically. So it's sort of something like this. If you look at this diagram here, you see there's this circle here. And in there, you have this thing called gods. So this is the cosmos, and then you have supernatural entities that are within the cosmos, that are within space-time, they're intervening in the world, and so on. Now, beyond the cosmos, but always sort of supporting the cosmos, you have this other thing, this called absolutely simple, unconditioned reality. That is God, capital G. So this big white thing represents the God of classical theism, the absolute reality that is always sustaining the cosmos, whereas the so-called small g gods, those are within the cosmos. So I think a lot of the atheist objections to theism, rightly, are actually directed not against God, the unconditioned reality, but against these gods. And I think science itself has supplanted the idea of demigods or gods that reside within the cosmos. I think there's certainly a case to be made for that. But if we're talking about the God, who's not within the cosmos, but who is the very source of the cosmos, as an unconditioned reality, there's actually nothing science could say about that God. One simple reason is this. According to classical theism, the one God is eternal, is outside time and space. So we're talking about a reality that does not change, doesn't undergo any change. All scientific experiments are based on observing change, right? All scientific experiments are the observation of interactions of physical things, even when it's tiny particles being blown up or something like that, or shooting photons at something. All of that is interactions. So what scientists can observe at best is change, motion, interaction. But an eternal reality like God in classical theism, an eternal reality doesn't change. It doesn't undergo any change. So because God is said to be eternal, there's no way any experiment could detect this God. And there's no way any experiment could disprove this God either. But if we're talking about gods, small g, gods who are said to sort of inhabit our cosmos and intervene in it, well, scientific experiment, if they exist, scientific experiment could detect them possibly, and scientific experiment could disprove them. So this is a very important distinction, God versus gods, and it's something David Bentley Hart also talks about in his book. So now I'm actually going to get to, we've talked so far about the limits and the scope of science, and we've talked about different kinds of theism, right? Anthropomorphic theism, like Greek gods, theistic personalism, and classical theism. The type of theism that I will be sort of talking about today in terms of the arguments for the existence of God is classical theism, not anthropomorphic theism and not theistic personalism. The arguments that I'm presenting to you, they establish classical theism. So that's very important to know. So we're about at an hour mark. So this would be a good time to hit pause and take a break. And when we come back, I'm not going to take a break, but for you watching, you can take a break. When we come back, I'm actually going to go through two arguments for the existence of God under classical theism. So, as I said, take a break, take a breather, have some water, eat your dinner, and then come right back and we'll continue. All right, so let us move forward. So the first argument we're going to look at today is from a very famous Muslim philosopher and scientist known as Ibn Sina, Avicenna. I'm not going to be able to give you his sort of life story today, but he's the most, I think he's the most influential Islamic thinker for the last 1,000 years. There have been like thousands of commentaries that later Muslims have written on his writings. And he's sort of in Muslim philosophical and theological tradition, Ibn Sina, and he's known as Avicenna in the Latin West. Avicenna or Ibn Sina basically replaces Aristotle. Before Ibn Sina was born, most people are reading Aristotle and interpreting Aristotle and writing commentaries on Aristotle. A lot of Muslim thinkers are doing this, but after Ibn Sina, they all start now referring to him instead of Aristotle. So he's very, very important. He's also a scientist. He wrote a book called The Canon of Medicine, and the Canon of Medicine was translated into European languages, and it was used in European hospitals probably up until like 2 or 3 centuries ago. So he's a philosopher and he's a doctor. He is a Muslim. He's not just a cultural Muslim. He's a believing Muslim. He believes in Islam. Of course, he interprets the idea of God, the idea of revelation and scripture. He has his own interpretation of those things, but he is a Muslim. He's a believing Muslim. It's said that, for example, when he was working, if he was working on a philosophical problem and he didn't know the answer, he would go do his Islamic prayers at the mosque, and then he would come back to continue working on the problem. I mean, this is what it said. So I'm going to share Ibn Sina's argument. for the existence of God. It's a very good argument, I think, but it's tough to understand. So I'm going to try to make it accessible. So let's begin. The argument begins with definitions, or at least I want to present his definitions. So Ibn Sina was looking at existence as a whole, right? You look around, different type of things exist, and he proposed. He said that there are two types of existence, right? Two types of existing things. One is called a contingent existence. So this is something that exists, and when you consider it on its own, you find that it may exist or it may not exist. So, if you find an apple or a computer or a cat or a house, all of those things are contingent existence, because there's nothing about a house that tells you that it must exist. Or when I find a banana in my kitchen, right, there's nothing about the banana that suggests that the banana had to exist. Rather, an apple or a banana or a house or a computer, they exist because they have a cause. Something caused them to come into existence, and they exist even right now due to causes. So a contingent existence is anything that exists that it did not have to exist, but because it does exist, it requires a cause. So it has cause or causes. So therefore, its existence, the existence of my computer, for example, is necessary through something else. It doesn't exist on its own. It depends on a cause or many causes at once. So particles, rocks, plants, animals, people, buildings, so on. These are all examples of contingent existence. A second type of thing that exists, that may exist, is a necessary existence. And a necessary existence is something that exists that when you consider it in itself, it has to be. It exists necessarily. So by its own nature, it always exists, and it must exist. It could never fail to exist. This is different from a contingent existence. A contingent existence is something that it possibly may exist, it possibly may not exist. But when it does exist, it's because some cause, makes it exist. But a necessary existence is something that it exists by itself. It does not have any causes, and therefore, it always exists, and it has always existed. That is a necessary existence. And Ibn Sina says that the necessary existence is what people call God, or Allah in Arabic. So God for Ibn Sina is the necessary existence through itself. Now here's the question that people will say, well, this is all, very nice and fancy. I think most people would accept that contingent existence, contingent things, they do exist, right? Most people would agree that we do have things in this world that are contingent existence. I know, I could be very skeptical, and maybe, we could doubt the existence of the world. I could doubt the existence of other people, but I think I'm pretty sure that that I exist and that I'm a contingent existence. I have not always existed. Even right now, even if I'm the only one that exists in the world, I am a contingent existence. And if I was, if I got injured or something, if something happened to my organs or my body, if the oxygen in this room was removed, I would cease to exist. So my existence right now, I'll just use my, as an example, or you can use yourself as an example. You and me, we are contingent existence. So at every moment, there are a bunch of causes that are allowing us to exist. And if you took away these causes, like the oxygen or my blood flow, or my organs or my lungs, if you take away any of these causes, I would not exist. So I'm a contingent existent. You are, if you're watching this video, you are probably one too. Now the question is, how do you know there is a necessary existent? I mean, it sounds very nice, you know, that which must exist cannot fail to exist. But how do we know there really is a necessary existent? So for this, Avicenna, Ibn Sina, gave us an argument. So we're going to look at his argument. But one thing we need to just consider is when he says contingent existent requires a cause, what type of causes is he talking about? That's the key. What type of causation are we talking about? So let us take the example of a house, right? A bunch of people, you know, how do you get a house? A house is built by people. Most of us would say that if you're asked, well, what's the cause of the house, right? What's the cause of the existence of the house? Most of us would say the builder or the builders are the causes of the existence of the house. And you know, if the builders cease to exist, the house still exists. The house is still there. The builders do their thing, they go away. You still have a house. Ibn Sina would tell us that when he says a contingent existent requires a cause, the builders in that sense are not the cause of the house. So here's what he says. This is from that text I cited at the beginning, the Danish Name. He says, the builder of the house is not actually the cause of the house, though he is responsible for the movement of wood to the place of the house. But this condition terminates after the builder or the maker of the house has left. So the builder, the people who built the house, they're not really the cause of the house. Ibn Sina says, the actual cause realizing the form of a house is the superimposition of the elements which constitute the house and their intrinsic nature, which necessitates the persistence of the house having that form. So what he's basically saying is this structure, this entire structure, which we call the house, the real cause of the house is not the builder, but what keeps the house in existence here and now and at every moment. So those things that allow the house to continue to exist in this way, those are the causes of the house. And that would actually be two things. The material of the house, right? So the wood and all the planks, the bricks. So the material that the house is made up of, and the particular arrangement of the material, right? If you change the arrangement of the wood, you don't have a house anymore. You have something else. So the house has, you could say, two sustaining causes: the wood, the material, and the arrangement or the superimposition of the material. So Ibn Sina says that the cause actualizing the form of the house is a synthesis of these two causes, right? The material and the arrangement of the material. The material by itself does not get you a house, and the arrangement by itself does not get you the house. It's the combination of the arrangement and the material. Those are the causes of the house. And that's basically what he says. The builder is not really the cause of the house. So what this tells us, and this is just one example, but there's many, causes are simultaneous with their effects. So the house is the effect. And for the house to exist, the causes of the house need to exist at the same time. If you get rid of the material, this is one of the causes, you don't have a house. So these are called sustaining causes. So causes are simultaneous with the effects as they are producing the effects. That is the key takeaway here. And this is true not just for the house, it's true for all contingent existence. It's true for me. Like if this root, I exist right here, right? My body and everything, my consciousness. If right now in this house, there are multiple causes that sustain my existence. If this room became a vacuum, right? If the air left this room, I would not be able to exist. So one of the sustaining causes for me, for my body, is the air pressure in the room. My organs, the air I'm breathing, my blood flow, at every moment, these causes are sustaining my existence. My parents are not really the causes of me. My parents are separate from me. If my parents did not exist, I would continue existing. So they're not my causes. But the air pressure in the room, my blood flow, my organs, my brain, the whole working of my body, those are the sustaining causes of me. That's the type of contingent existence I am. And this is true for many things. So this is not just an Ibn Sina idea, right? This is a widespread idea that causes are simultaneous with their effects. So Immanuel Kant, who is no fan of Ibn Sina's argument, he simply says that the great majority of efficient natural causes are simultaneous with their effects. Now, it's true that sometimes a cause can take time to produce the effect, but it doesn't change the fact that the cause's operation is always simultaneous with the effect that it produces. This is very, very important, because if the cause ceases to exist, the effect will cease to exist. Very, very important. So now we can go to the argument. Now here's the argument in textual form. You have a copy of these slides. So you can actually go, if this is the type of argument that you like in this form, you can go and read this by yourself. I'm not going to read out this slide, but for those who want to, you can pause the video right here and you can sort of read this step by step. This is Ibn Sina's argument. He wants to show that there is at least one necessary being or necessary existence in all of reality. That's what Ibn Sina needs to argue. And these are the steps he takes. Now, what I'm going to do, instead of reading this out for you, which I could, but I'm not going to read it out, I am attempting to show you this argument in a more visual form. That's what I'm going to do. Ibn Sina didn't show it this way, but I'm going to attempt to do that. So here we go. Again, this is Ibn Sina's argument for the existence of God, and he refers to God as the necessary existence. He wants to prove that there is a necessary being or a necessary existence in reality. So here's how he does it. Again, a visual form. Ibn Sina begins his argument with the simple observation that something exists. And that is, well, that's how he begins, right? So something exists. And what he will do is he will basically, he'll start from that point, and he'll try to sort of deduce further examples. That's what he's going to do. Now, before I get to this, I just want to, let me just go back. So this is, of course, this is what Ibn Sina had. This is the textual form, you could say, of his argument. And it's worth just sort of, you know, reflecting on that for a little bit. So you can just see what that is. Because what, as I said, I'm going to try to show it to you visually. Now you can find many books written on the textual form of this argument by John McGinnis and Herbert Davidson and others. So a lot of people have written about this. You'll probably find blogs about it online. Now I'm going to look at this from a different perspective. I'm going to try to show it to you visually. So we begin with this idea that something exists, right? Ibn Sina would say there's no doubt that there is existence. Now, whatever exists, you could take anything as your starting point. Take yourself, take anything. Whatever exists, whatever you start with, it either depends on, assuming you're starting with a contingent existence, it either depends on the necessary being, necessary existence, in which case you've proven that there is a necessary existence, or it depends on a contingent being, right? So something exists, it has a cause, right? Let's say you start with an apple. The apple has a cause. Either it is directly caused, it depends on the necessary existence itself, in which case we're done, or it depends on some other contingent being. Now let's try to be very, very skeptical and avoid the conclusion of that there is a necessary being. So let's say it depends on a contingent being. Now that contingent being, either it depends on the necessary being, in which case, again, we're done, it's been proven, or it depends on another contingent being. And for the sake of argument, let's pick the latter. All right, so that contingent being, again, it's contingent, right? This is contingent, this is contingent, this is contingent. So you have to go through the same thing. This contingent being, either it depends on the necessary being, so the argument is complete, or it depends on another contingent being. And again, let's try to avoid the conclusion that there is a necessary being. So we'll remove that. Same thing here. So every contingent being that we come across, it either depends on a necessary being or it depends on a contingent being. Now we could keep doing this, right? For every, like, you could repeat this process. You don't need to, now I don't need to actually step out of my house and tour the whole universe to do this operation logically. I'm simply using logical deduction here to do this. I don't need to go physically observe every contingent being. It's simply not, it's not necessary for me to do that. We may think it is, but it's not. Because whatever exists, it's either going to be necessary or it's going to be contingent. There's no half necessary, half contingent being. There's no third option. So it doesn't actually matter how much of the universe I know about, physically speaking, because necessary and contingent are the only two categories that something could be. So just starting with the fact that there are some contingent beings that exist that I know about, I can do this logical deduction. And what will happen is, in every case, every contingent being either depends directly on a necessary being or it depends on another contingent being. Now let's repeat this process, almost like recursion in a sense. Let's keep repeating it until we have an infinite number of contingent beings. Hypothetically, let's say that's what we have, right? So we have an infinite, you could say we have a set. We have a set of all contingent beings. Let's say that's what we have now. So every contingent being. Now you can be as imaginative as you want on this. Let's include dark matter, black holes, anything you can think of. We could, let's say there's a multiverse. So let's say there's like 10,000 universes. We'll put them in there too. Anything, like you could imagine as much as you want, you could put in here. We could assume that we're in a simulation, whatever scenario of physical reality that you come up with, this argument will still apply. It will still apply. Now at this stage, I don't need to know what particular beings fall into here. So you may ask, well, what if our black holes contingent beings? Well, at this point we don't know. All we know is there are contingent beings, and if there are an infinite number, this is what we get. So here's the question. Ibn Sina tells us regarding this set. So now we have a set of all contingents. I don't need to know what they all are. I don't need to survey the whole universe to know what they are. I simply know that there are such a thing as contingent beings. Ibn Sina will refer to this set, this aggregate, and he says, well, these are all contingent beings. So by definition, all of these are caused, and they all depend on a cause. So he says that the whole set either requires no cause. Okay, so there are possibilities. So either the whole set here doesn't have a cause. The set itself is a necessary being. So that's one option. Is this the case? Let's think about it. Could the whole set of contingent beings be a necessary being? Some of people will say yes, and they'll end it at that. But if you add up all the contingent beings together, an infinite number of them, together they become a necessary being. Here's the problem with that. If we assume that's the case, what we basically did is we caused a necessary being, right? This necessary being in this, if you define the necessary being as the set of all contingent beings, it means the necessary being depends on the coming together of infinite contingent beings. But anything that depends on other things to exist is not a necessary being. It's not. So this possibility is false because it actually violates the very definition of the necessary being is that which has no cause. And if it has no cause, it can't depend on other things. And if the set of all contingents was a necessary being, that would mean the necessary being depends on the existence of other things. So that's out. Ibn Sina tells us that even if the series regresses to infinity, each individual of the series is contingent in itself, and the aggregate depends upon the individual. So therefore, it is not necessary. In other words, this set of contingent beings, it's not a necessary being. It's not a necessary existent. It's a contingent existent. So the whole set itself is a contingent existent. So maybe all of, maybe it can be caused by itself, right? All the members could be the cause. Again, this of course doesn't work. It leads to the same problem as before. If the members are the cause of the set, but then each member itself depends on another cause. So that doesn't really work. It could be that one of the members here is a cause. Let's say, maybe the last, of course, there's no last member here, it's infinite, but even if there was a last member, if the last member of the set of contingent beings, if the last one was a contingent being, it would require its own cause, and there'd be nobody left, so it wouldn't exist, and then nobody would exist. So that's out too. The only solution is that there must be a cause of the set. Like this set of all contingent beings requires a cause external to it. That's the only way to get out of this. Okay, so let us say that there is a contingent being that's outside the set, and the set of all contingent beings depends on this one contingent being. This looks to be a good solution, I think, right? We've solved the problem. We don't need to appeal to a necessary being. Of course, there's two problems with this. The first is, if the set of all contingent beings depends on a contingent being, what does this contingent being depend on? So you run into the same problem. The second problem with this is, if it's the set of all contingent beings, this contingent being that we say it depends on actually belongs inside the set. So the set of all contingent beings depends on a cause external to it, but that cannot be another contingent being. So now we're out of options. And the only thing left, the only logically possible scenario for the set of all contingent beings is that the set itself depends on a necessary existent. That's it. That's the only option. Ibn Sina himself says this in his writings. And what has happened here, what we have here, is Ibn Sina's argument that basically, if we start with the fact that something exists, doesn't matter what that is, if something exists, this something, either it is a necessary being or it's a contingent being. Now, if it is a necessary being, we've proven the existence of a necessary being, and we're done. If this something is a contingent being, then it depends on another contingent being. And then you do the same operation here. And you can go all the way through. We can reach an infinity of contingent beings, but the whole infinite set here, because everything is inside of it is contingent, it itself needs to depend on something else to exist. The set of contingent beings is itself contingent. It cannot be depending on another contingent being because they're all inside here. So therefore, the set of all contingent beings depends on a necessary being. Therefore, at least one necessary being exists. That is what Ibn Sina's argument shows. Again, the assumption here is that whatever exists is either contingent or necessary. There's no middle option. And it assumes here, the assumption is that a contingent being, whatever it is, being contingent depends on a cause. Somebody might say that maybe we can have contingent beings without a cause. We'll talk about that at the end. That would be a brute fact, but that is one way out of the argument. You could say that you could sort of get rid of the necessary being and say maybe these contingent beings are just brute facts. They don't have a cause. They're contingent. They don't have to exist, but they do, and that's it. We're going to leave it. So that's one way out of it. But if you accept the logic that something that exists either is contingent or necessary, it is unavoidable. We are left to postulate the existence of at least one necessary being. And the argument actually continues from here, and we'll pick up this argument again, because we're still not at the idea of the necessary being as God. Somebody might say, well, this doesn't prove God, it just proves, possibly one necessary being, and that's correct. So there's further argumentation. But this is where Avicenna gets us to this point. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to switch over. We're going to switch over to a contemporary argument by two authors, David Bentley Hart and Robert Spitzer, and this is called the Unconditioned Reality argument. So that's what we're going to look at, for the next bit. So we're now going to look at a more recent argument for the existence of God, which has come from these two authors. And this is called the unconditioned reality argument. So they begin with definitions. So the first thing, and this is similar to Ibn Sina's argument, but it's still a different argument. So the first thing is they define a conditioned reality. And a conditioned reality, according to them, is any reality, a particle, a wave, physical laws of nature, whatever it is, any reality which, during the time that it exists, is dependent upon another reality for its existence. And the example that they give often of a conditioned reality is a cat. So if you have a cat, that cat, as and when it exists, it is dependent upon its cells and the structure of its cells. But then those cells in the cat, those cells are conditioned realities too. They depend on molecules and the structure, the molecular structure of those molecules. Molecules are also a conditioned reality. They depend on atoms and the structure of those atoms. And an atom is also a conditioned reality. It depends on protons and other things. Protons too. So what this is basically saying is that, we have certain things in the known world that as they exist, in order to exist, they depend on other things. And you could draw this sort of dependency tree for many, many things that we know about. I actually already gave you the example of myself. My existence right now is dependent on a whole host of things. So a cat is a conditioned reality. I'm a conditioned reality. You're a conditioned reality. This computer is a conditioned reality, and so on and so forth. And then they also define a second thing, second term called unconditioned reality. And unconditioned reality is any reality that does not depend on another reality to exist. Right? So an unconditioned reality, it exists independently or self-sufficiently. And according to many classical theologies, this is the concept of God. And we'll actually see how that really works out. Now, the first part of this argument simply says that in the real world, in the world as we know it, there are some conditioned realities. We don't need to know about the whole universe to know that some conditioned realities exist. David Bentley Hart makes this point in his book. Right? He says that one is dependent on an incalculable number of even greater and smaller finite conditions, some of which are temporal and some of which are definitely not. And all those conditions themselves depend on further conditions. So he goes on to talk about how, we ourselves, we are made up of parts, right? We're made up of parts. Our parts are made up of smaller parts, and so on and so forth. You could trace it all the way down to the quantum level if you want. And if you sort of zoom out from there, we're part of a wider ecosystem of different conditioned realities, and so on and so forth. So what David Bentley Hart tells us is, and this is a very non-controversial statement, that all of physical reality is filled with conditioned realities. So we certainly know some conditioned realities exist. From the fact that conditioned realities exist in the world, what the argument is going to try to do is we're going to try to see is there such thing as an unconditioned reality, right? So does an unconditioned reality exist? That's what this argument is trying to prove. It's trying to prove that if conditioned realities exist, then an unconditioned reality also exists. So here's how it's done. So if you think about this, you have the two definitions, right? Conditioned reality, that which depends on other things to exist, and then unconditioned reality, that which does not depend on anything else to exist. Those are your definitions. We know conditioned realities exist. I think everybody would agree with that. I think science has shown us that. Do unconditioned realities exist? We don't know. That's what the argument is for. And they, these authors, they use something called a disjunction. So here's what they do. So Robert Spitzer tells us in his book, this is a graphic from his book. He says that there are, for all of reality, there's only two options. Option one, which we'll call P, we'll call it scenario P. According to option one, there are no unconditioned realities in all of reality. Only conditioned realities exist. Okay, so option one, you could call this the atheist scenario. There are only conditioned realities in all of reality. There are no unconditioned realities. So we'll call that P. Option two is there are conditioned realities, and there is at least one unconditioned reality in existence. At least one. There, at this point, there could be 10, I don't know, but there's at least one. Right? There's at least one reality that exists that doesn't depend on anything else. So we'll call that Q. So we have scenario P and we have scenario Q. Now, these two options, these two scenarios, they are, you could say they're logical opposites, or they're like contradictory. So this scenario is the total opposite of this one. What that means is that if this is true, then this is false. And if this is true, so if P is true, Q is false. If Q is true, then P is false, because they're opposites. And how do we actually know which option is correct? That is the question, right? Is P correct? Is P true or is Q true? Here's how we could go about it. So one thing we could do, one way to investigate this, we could try to go find an unconditioned reality. We can get in a spaceship, we can get a microscope, we can start looking all over, we could try to look at the quantum level, we could try to go, do a Star Trek thing and explore the galaxy, and we can go searching for an unconditioned reality, and if you found one, then you would know Q is true. That's one way to do it. Obviously, we can't do that, right? We don't even have the technology to do such a thing. Is there any other way to decide whether P is true or Q is true? Now, what we do know is these are opposite, they're contradictory. So if one is proven true, the other is false. But it's also the case, logically speaking, that if I can prove one of these to be false, the other one will be true. That's just pure logic. So this is called the disjunctive syllogism, and that's how we're actually going to do it. So we have P or Q, right? P or Q. If I can show that P is false, what you call not P, then Q is true. So if I can disprove the claim that only conditioned realities exist, if I disprove that, it will be true, logically speaking, that at least one unconditioned reality exists. And this would not be a probability-based conclusion. It would actually be a logically certain conclusion. That's what the rules of logic tell us. So you have P or Q. If they're logical opposites, not P would mean yes Q. Similarly, not Q would mean yes P. So this is the strategy. So because we don't have the technology and it's probably impossible to go tour the universe to find an unconditioned reality, because who knows, there could be realities beyond our universe, we don't know. It's better we actually try to use logical deduction and investigate scenario P. So that's what we'll do. And scenario P can work out in two ways. Again, this is from Robert Spitzer's book. It could be that there is only, in all of reality, it could be that there's only a finite number of conditioned realities. So there's only conditioned realities, but there's only a finite number. That's one option. Another option in scenario P, it could be that there are an infinite number of conditioned realities in reality. That could also be true. So we need to investigate both of those. We need to see if any of these are actually true or not. Of course, if we can prove that P is true, then Q would be false, and then we're done. Similarly, if we prove that P is false, then Q would be true. So let's check it out. So let's begin with scenario PF, so finite P. That would mean in all of reality, you have a finite number of conditioned realities only. All right, so what that would mean is something like this. If you take the cat as the example, so the cat depends on cells and the structure of cells. That depends on molecules, which depend on atoms, which depends on protons, which depend on quarks. Let's say it keeps going until some number, any number, right? 50, 100, whatever it is, some finite number. So we reach the xth, or the last conditioned reality in the chain. Now, after the last one, there are no more conditioned realities. We're done. We ran out of them. Now, the problem here is once you've reached the xth conditioned reality, where x is the last one, doesn't matter what the number is, that conditioned reality, the last one, would actually need some other thing to depend on, because it's a conditioned reality, right? This is the scenario of conditioned realities only. There's no unconditioned reality. So you only have conditioned realities, and there's a finite number, so you're at the last level of them, and the last one it depends on something else to exist, but you're out. It's the last one. So actually, the last conditioned reality cannot exist because it has nothing, it has no cause to keep it in existence because it's the last one. So this last one will not exist. And if the last conditioned reality does not exist, everything above it, because these all depend on it, they will not exist either. So the scenario that there are only a finite number of conditioned realities, the way it actually works out logically is that no conditioned realities actually exist. So that scenario actually leads to the existence of nothing. Nothing exists. But if you look around here right now, things clearly do exist. And what this means is we have a contradiction between this scenario and actual reality. And that tells us that this scenario, finite number of conditioned realities in all of reality, is false because we ran into a contradiction. So logically speaking, what this means is that the idea that there could only be a finite number of conditioned realities is false. It's impossible. It's logically impossible. There's no such thing. Now, we can be a little smarter and we can say, well, instead of having a hierarchy of realities, what if we do it like this? What if we have a finite number of conditioned realities and they exist in a circle? So the last one, X, depends on the first one. That seems to be a good solution to the problem, right? The issue here ultimately is this. If CR1 depends on 2, 2 depends on 3, all the way depends on X, and X depends on 1 again, it really means that CR1 depends to exist on itself. Okay, what's wrong with that? The problem here is CR1 is a conditioned reality. A conditioned reality, by definition, cannot cause itself to exist, and it can't depend on itself. To be conditioned reality means to depend on something else. So therefore, this scenario, a circular chain of conditioned realities only, it's impossible. It would result in the existence of nothing. But if you look around, things do exist. So this scenario, it cannot be true. So we can sort of fill in. Hypothesis F, finite number of conditions, is false. It's just not possible. Logically speaking, it's not possible. Okay, so now let's go to the next one. Let's check infinite number of conditioned realities. Maybe that's a better solution. So that would mean that in all, this is the next scenario. There is only an infinite number of conditioned realities in existence. There's no unconditioned reality. That's what this means. So, we'll look something like this. You have this chain, A depends on B, B depends on C, C depends on D. It goes on for infinitely. Each one depends on the next one in an infinite chain. Now, this seems to be promising. It goes on forever. An infinite chain of conditioned realities, an infinite chain of dependence. But keep in mind, and this is why I pointed out before, right? The causation that we're talking about here is not, this chain of causation is not about temporal causation. So we're not talking about an infinite sequence of time. We are talking about a dependence that is happening in every moment of time. So conditioned reality A, at every moment it exists, it depends on conditioned reality B. So whether there is a Big Bang or not is irrelevant. Even if the universe from a time perspective has always existed, that's irrelevant to what's happening here. Rather, at every time period, in every moment, conditioned reality A depends on conditioned reality B. And B depends on C, and C depends on D, and so on. So this dependence is simultaneous for the whole series. If that's the case, right, this dependence is simultaneous. We're not talking about temporal causation. With simultaneous dependence, this set of infinite series by itself, it still cannot exist. No conditioned reality in the infinite series of conditions is ever fulfilled, because none of the members of this series have the power to exist on their own. So even an infinite number of them, no member can actually give existence to the next one, because it doesn't even possess it itself. Think about it. If you start with finite number of conditioned realities and you keep upping the number, 1,000, 1,000,000, a billion, 100 billion. It doesn't matter how many conditioned realities you have. If that's all you have, you still end up with the existence of nothing when you're talking about finite. So as n goes to infinity, your result doesn't change. Even if you look at it from a different perspective, if this entire set, the set of infinite conditioned realities, the whole totality of it, if you bring it all together, that is still a conditioned reality. Uh, it's not like the totality of infinite conditioned reality somehow equals an unconditioned reality. Even if we wanted that to be the case, it couldn't be the case, simply because it would mean that this unconditioned reality that you constructed is dependent on all these conditioned realities. So that can't be the case. You can't add up conditioned realities to infinity and somehow we end up with something that exists on its own. That's not possible. So in the end, even the idea that there is only an infinite number of conditioned realities in all of existence, that is logically impossible as well. It's logically impossible. Where does that leave us then? Well, if we go back to our little thing here, so the scenario of there is only a finite number of conditioned realities in all reality, that is false. Logically speaking, it's false. We disproved it. The scenario that there's an infinite number of conditioned realities in all of reality only, that is also false. Therefore, the whole of scenario P that we see here, we've actually, just using logic, right? I don't have to go in a spaceship and examine dark matter, or I don't have to do that to know that the scenario of only conditioned realities and no unconditioned reality, that scenario is false. Logic alone allows us to conclude that scenario P, no unconditioned realities, only conditioned realities, is not true. Now, if we go back to this, we've just proven that scenario P as a whole is not true. So we have P or Q, and then not P. So P false, therefore Q, which means this has shown that if it is false that only conditioned realities exist in all of reality, it is logically true that at least one unconditioned reality must exist. This is simply the logic of the disjunctive syllogism. These are the rules of logic. Now, keep in mind, what did we already point out? The rules of logic don't depend on science. Rather, science depends on the rules of logic. So what science has to say about the universe, completely irrelevant to the argument being made here. And also, again, this is about conditioned versus unconditioned realities. It makes no difference whether the material universe began with the Big Bang or whether it always existed. All of that doesn't matter. This argument is just as effective for an eternal universe, because even if you have a universe that lasts forever, that universe is still populated by conditioned realities. So the question still remains, can you only have conditioned realities in all of reality, or do you need at least one unconditioned reality? And the rules of logic pretty much lead to the conclusion that there must be at least one unconditioned reality in all of reality. So now let's move forward. So we took two routes here. Avicenna's argument, based on what I showed you, concluded with there has to be at least one necessary being in reality. We tried to avoid it, but that's where we ended up. David Bentley, Hart, and Robert Spitzer's argument has also concluded at this point that there's at least one unconditioned reality in all of reality. So now both arguments are sort of parked at the same spot. There's at least one necessary being or one unconditioned reality. Now we can actually move forward, because if somebody watching this is thinking, well, this is all very interesting, but for all we know, the necessary being or the unconditioned reality, it just could be a black hole. It could be, it could be an atom. It could be like a particle. At this point, you could be right. We don't know anything yet about what this unconditioned reality is. It just could be some material substance. So you're absolutely right. And at this stage in the argument, there's no reason to think that the unconditioned reality corresponds to what we call God. We're not there yet. There are further steps. So here's what they are. So to begin, there's at least one unconditioned reality or one necessary being in existence. There's at least one. For all we know, there could be 10, there could be a billion unconditioned realities, there could be an infinite number of unconditioned realities. I don't know. But let's see what we can find out about unconditioned realities based on the fact that at least one exists. That's what we've shown. So by definition, any unconditioned reality is uncaused, right? Unconditioned reality, necessary being, it exists, but it doesn't rely on anything to exist. So it doesn't have any cause. It is uncaused, it is causeless. That's uncontroversial. That's what we've shown. That's what the arguments have shown. Following from this fact, it follows if the unconditioned reality is uncaused, if it has no cause, it would also mean that any unconditioned reality is absolutely simple. In other words, it does not have any parts. It's not made up of parts of any kind. Why is that the case? Well, two philosophers and others have said that if the unconditioned reality, or if the first cause, as Farabi says, if it had parts that made it up, that would mean that it is caused by those parts. That's the argument. So if an unconditioned reality consisted of parts, right, components, then it would be dependent on those components, and the parts that make it up, they would be its cause. Okay, so what's wrong with that? Well, the only problem here is that if an unconditioned reality was dependent on its parts, and if it was caused by its parts, it's not really an unconditioned reality. It would be a conditioned reality. And we might say, okay, fine, let it be a conditioned reality. Who cares? Well, that's fine, but the argument just showed that at least one unconditioned reality exists. So whatever those unconditioned realities are, they don't have any parts. Right? So every unconditioned reality, even if there's 10 of them, they would have no parts. They have no parts because they have no cause. An unconditioned reality has no cause because it is an unconditioned reality. It doesn't depend on any conditions. So following from this, that every unconditioned reality has no parts, it would further follow that if you had more than one unconditioned reality, if you had 2, if you had 4, if you had any number of them, each of these unconditioned realities would have to possess something, some feature, some property that the other unconditioned realities don't have. Does that make sense? So let's start with 2. So let's say there's 2 unconditioned realities. You are 1, you are 2, right? Let's say there's 2 of them. If there really are 2 of them, each of these would have to consist, because they have to be different in some way. If there's no difference between them at all, then there's really only one. So they have to be different. And if they were different from each other, they would have to have something in common, and they would each have to have something that the other didn't have. So each of these unconditioned realities, if there's 2 unconditioned realities, they would each be made up of a common part and a different part, right? A shared nature and a differentia, if you will. That would mean that if there's 2 of them, each unconditioned reality or each necessary being would actually be composed of parts, right? So the only way you can have 2 unconditioned realities is if both of them are composed of parts, a common part and a differential part, some differentiating features. Okay, what is wrong? What's the problem with that? Let us have 2. The problem with that is any unconditioned reality that is composed of parts is not really an unconditioned reality. So Is it possible to have two or more unconditioned realities? It's actually not possible for the reasons we've explained. If there were two, they would have parts, and actually they would be conditioned realities. So we are forced, by the force of logic, we have to conclude that from the previous step, there is at least one unconditioned reality. There is at least one necessary being. This analysis shows that there's actually only one single, simple, unconditioned reality. That is just what the logical deduction leads you to. But why? Well, it's because any unconditioned reality has no cause, therefore it has no parts. And if it has no parts, there can only be one. If there are two or more, it would require common and differential components in the unconditioned reality. And if that were the case, it would be conditioned. Therefore, there cannot be two unconditioned realities. There's only one unconditioned reality. So now there's one of them. Now we can talk about the unconditioned reality, or the necessary being. So moving forward, knowing that there's only one and that it has no parts, right? No parts whatsoever. So what does it mean? So we call that simplicity. People call this simplicity. So the necessary being, the unconditioned reality, is simple, right? Because it has no parts. It has no inner parts. It's not made up of anything. And we're not just talking about material parts. It couldn't have any metaphysical parts either. So hypothetically speaking, whatever this unconditioned reality is, it can't be like a combination of Platonic ideas or Platonic forms. It can't be made up of thoughts. It can't be made up of information, because all of that contains multiplicity. So Robert Spitzer has a very good explanation of what simplicity would mean in this context. He defines simplicity as without intrinsic or extrinsic boundaries, which is a very good definition of simplicity. Because if you think about it, something that has no differentiation from within or from without, if you had such a reality, it would be unbounded. It wouldn't be bound by anything. It has no differentiation, right? It has no parts. So nothing could infringe on this reality. So that would mean the unconditioned reality is both simple, without parts, and therefore unbounded. Infinite could be another word, but I'd rather use the word unbounded or unrestricted. What do we mean by boundaries? So Robert Spitzer gives this good example. So the boundaries of any particular thing are generally, it's those boundaries make something what it is. The boundaries of a conditioned reality make that reality different from other conditioned realities. So for example, he explains that the boundaries of squares exclude the boundaries of circles. So squares are squares and circles are circles because they have different bounds. You can't, squares, you can't have like something that's both square and circle. You can't have a shape that's both. It's either one or the other. Similarly, the boundaries of what makes an electron excludes the boundaries of what makes something a proton. Something cannot be an electron and a proton at the same time because the boundaries of each are different. The boundaries of waves exclude the boundaries of particles. So the attributes, the properties of waves are different from the properties of particles, and something cannot be a wave and a particle at the same time and place. So Robert Spitzer tells us that if you look at these examples, waves versus particles, right? They're mutually exclusive because they're bounded. But an electron, this is the example he gives, an electron can behave as a particle in some conditions, and it behaves as a wave in other conditions. It's never both at the same time, but in one situation it's a wave, in another it's a particle. You've heard of the double slit experiment and all this stuff. Why is that the case? Well, he tells us, Robert Spitzer tells us, that this is because the electron in and of itself is simpler and less bounded than waves and particles. So an electron is a simpler, less bounded reality than waves and particles. And that's why the electron itself, it's not limited to being a wave or a particle. In one context, it manifests as a wave, in another as a particle. Similarly, Robert Spitzer writes that although electrons and protons are different, right? They're not the same thing. They can't be the same thing. An electromagnetic field allows for protons and electrons to interact because an electromagnetic field is simpler and less bounded than electrons and protons. So what's happening here is you have certain conditioned realities that they're bounded, and their bounds are mutually exclusive, but then there's another kind of conditioned reality that is less bounded than both, and the electron is able to accommodate the boundaries of waves and particles. The electromagnetic field is able to accommodate the boundaries of electrons and protons. That's what these are just analogies and examples. In other words, a simpler, less bounded reality is compatible with, inclusive of, and capable of accommodating, hosting, or sustaining a less simple, more bounded reality. That is what these examples are showing. Another example of simple, so that is what it means to be simple, right? Or unbounded. That which is more simple and more unbounded is ultimately more compatible with, more inclusive of, and more capable of hosting or sustaining things that are less simple and more bounded. That makes sense. Another example of simplicity, to use a non-physical example, is we have different thoughts in our mind, right? We can think about many different things, and each thought is very focused on its content, right? One thought could be about something, and the next thought is about something else. One thought can't really contain everything, but so our thoughts have bounds. But the act of thinking we're able to accommodate many thoughts when we think, right? We are able to think many different kinds of thoughts. You're not restricted to thinking only about one thing. So the act of thinking is simpler, it's more inclusive than specific thoughts. So that's another example of simplicity. Now, what does all this mean? Well, what this tells us, and these are just the examples. So this unconditioned reality, there's only one unconditioned reality, and we know it has no parts, so it has no boundaries. It's totally simple. And therefore, this unconditioned reality, it would be total oneness, if you think about it. Because it has no boundaries, it has no, it has no parts, it would be absolute unity. It would be completely one. It would be more one than, the number one. It would transcend all duality, the unconditioned reality, whatever it is, right? It would be a unitary reality, and it would be a transcendent reality because it is both simple, it has no differentiation, and because it's simple, it has no bounds. So it's absolutely transcendent. One scholar named Aziz Ismail has talked about this in one of his articles. Referring to the unconditioned reality, he says that this ultimate reality is often conceived as transcendent or described as, quote, he who is above all else. And what does that mean, he who is above all else? Right? We often encounter this symbolism when people talk about God. God is above everything, right? God is transcendent. We are tempted to interpret that in spatial terms. We think that means God is sort of physically outside the universe. But in this case, the notion of transcendence doesn't simply mean that. As Ismail says, this reality is called he who is above all else, not because it is a reality spatially above the human habitat, but because it is above, i.e., goes beyond or transcends all human categories. Being free from and prior to the dichotomy, duality, between subject and object, it is therefore also outside the frame of human discourse. So when people say that unconditioned reality or God or whatever is transcendent, this is what it would mean. Transcendent in the sense of unbounded and absolutely simple, not transcendent in a spatial sense. So that being the case, if this simple, unbounded, unconditioned reality is, if it exists, that would also mean that, remember, simpler realities are less bounded, and a simpler reality is compatible with and capable of sustaining bounded realities. So therefore, this unconditioned reality which is absolutely simple and absolutely unbounded, it would be compatible with and capable of sustaining all bounded conditioned realities. Right? So the existence of the unconditioned reality, it does not compete with, or you could say it doesn't cause other conditioned realities to cease to exist. Rather, because it is so simple and unbounded, the unconditioned reality would easily accommodate the existence of all other finite, conditioned realities. That's the point being made, and this is the argument that Robert Spitzer makes. So let's sort of put things together. Where are we now? So we're at this point where there is a single, simple, unbounded conditioned reality. There's only one. And the next thing that follows is whatever this reality is, because somebody may ask, well, how do we know it's not a particle? But whatever the reality is, it has to be immaterial. Why? Well, all material objects, particles, waves, molecules, atoms, quantum fields, whatever it is, they all are conditioned by space, time, extension, and position. Right? All material reality is conditioned by material qualities. Even at the quantum level, right? Even at the quantum level, position is still described in probabilistic terms using a wave function, for example. So that quality of position and time is still there. The limits are still there. So anything material is limited. And if it's limited, it would also be composed of certain parts, because if you don't have parts, there would be no limitation. For that reason, because all material realities are limited and constrained and composed of parts, the unconditioned reality has to be immaterial. It has to transcend materiality. That's one point. The second point, the unconditioned reality would also have to be eternal. Now, the word eternal tends to have two meanings, right? One meaning of eternal means it exists for an infinite amount of time. That's one meaning. Eternal here means something different. Eternal here doesn't mean lasting an infinite amount of time. Eternal here would mean utterly transcending time and change, which is to say that the unconditioned reality is beyond time. It doesn't go through time, and it doesn't change. It is immutable. This is what David Bentley Hart explains in his book. Referring to this as God, he says God is eternal, not in the sense of possessing limitless duration, but in the sense of transcending time altogether. If you think about this very closely, if the unconditioned reality was within time, that would be changing. It would be a changing reality. And if it's changing, that would mean it is limited, because if it can change into something else, that means it was lacking something before. And if it can change, some part of it would stay the same and some part of it would change. So it would be composed of parts. If any of that were the case, the unconditioned reality would not be an unconditioned reality, it would be a conditioned reality. So the only conclusion one could draw is that the unconditioned reality is eternal, it transcends time. So if we add this all up, what we have, again, all of this, let me remind everybody, all of this so far has been established through logical deduction. We have not relied on any sort of probabilistic arguments or anything like that. whether there's a Big Bang or not, that's irrelevant. There's the fact that the universe begins or not is not part of this argument, right? So through simple logical deduction, is it possible that there are only conditioned realities, or is there at least one unconditioned reality? And if you prove that the conditioned reality scenario only is false, then the unconditioned reality scenario is true. Then you simply logically deduce what an unconditioned reality is. And that's what leads you to this conclusion, that there is one single, simple, unique, immaterial, eternal, and unbounded, unconditioned reality, or in Ibn Sina's terms, necessary being. There's one of them, and it has all these properties. And these are not really properties. If you think about it, one, single, simple, unique, immaterial, eternal, unbounded, these are all negations, right? This is all the negation of limitation from this reality. It would mean that if there's one unconditioned reality, all other realities, and it doesn't matter what they are. Again, if you want to be very skeptical, pretend that our universe is in a simulation that exists in another universe, and there's 10 levels of simulation. Let's take that, for example. It doesn't matter how many simulations there are. It doesn't matter if there's a billion other universes. It doesn't matter if there are parallel realities. Accept all of it. At the end of the day, there's one unconditioned reality, and then everything else is a conditioned reality. No matter how vast it could be, no matter how complicated, everything else is a conditioned reality. So there's one unconditioned reality, and there's multiple conditioned realities. And it would also mean, if one takes this argument on board, all the conditioned realities, no matter what they are, again, you can blow it up to the most complex structure of reality. Whatever the conditioned realities are, through whatever chains of causation we have, and they're probably very complicated, all conditioned realities depend on the unconditioned reality to exist. Not directly, but at the end of the day, all these different chains of reality, whatever they are, they will all terminate in the unconditioned reality at every moment. At every moment, at every instant, the unconditioned reality is sustaining and creating the conditioned realities. For this reason, we would not be wrong to say that the unconditioned reality is the continuous creator of all other realities. Robert Spitzer writes about this in his book. He says that the creator, which he defines as the unique, absolutely simple, unrestricted, unconditioned reality itself, must be a continuous creator of all else that is real at every moment it could cease to be real. Analogous, to speak differently, he says that if the creator stopped thinking about us, this is an analogy. If the creator stopped thinking about us, we would literally lapse into nothingness, which is to say, at this very moment, I mean, it's hard to believe, I know, but if this argument is correct, at this very moment, our existence is being sustained and produced through all these chains of conditioned realities. Our existence is being produced and fulfilled and sustained by this one unconditioned reality with every breath we take. A Muslim writer, this is Sir Sultan Muhammad Shah Aga Khan III, he writes in his memoirs, which he wrote in the 1950s, he writes something very, very similar to this. He says, this is from an Islamic perspective, right? Spitzer is a Christian, Aga Khan, Sultan Muhammad Shah is a Muslim, right? For those who don't know, right, the Aga Khan is the hereditary imam of the Ismailis. So he writes that the creation, according to Islam, is not a unique act in a given time, but a perpetual and constant event. And God supports and sustains all existence at every moment by his will and his thought. So he's basically saying that, according to his belief as a Muslim, God is supporting, sustaining all existence at every moment. That's precisely what this argument for unconditioned reality is telling us. That's what the argument is concluding. So again, at this point now, we have shown, either through Ibn Sina's argument or through Hart and Spitzer's argument, that There is one single, simple, unique, immaterial, eternal, unbounded, unconditioned reality, and this unconditioned reality is the continuous creator of everything that exists. Now, many people would probably agree that this corresponds in many theologies to God. This is the concept of God. At least this is the classical concept of God. Now, people can go further on this, right? We've established this at the top through logical deductions, right? Through these arguments. But theologians will go further on this. They'll start with this idea, but they'll go further. So one can offer additional arguments through deductions or inferences from features of the cosmos. And these are all separate arguments. So these are not part of the main argument. So if one considers and I'm not saying that I agree with all these arguments or that they're good arguments, but they're used. So I just want to summarize them. So one could say, well, the very existence of contingent beings, of the very fact that there are contingent beings or conditioned realities, that proves, again, if you've already proven that there is an unconditioned reality, right? So let's assume, for argument's sake, that there is an unconditioned reality and it is simple, unbounded, and eternal, and so on, that it is this continuous creator. So then you make these further deductions. So one is that whatever this unconditioned reality is, it has creative power, and that the very fact that it is giving existence to conditioned realities, some would say that is an act of compassion, right? To grant existence to that which does not exist is an act of compassion. Some have argued this. Some other people, thinkers, theologians, they look at the natural world and they say, look, there are laws of nature. Even the simplest laws of nature, the laws of nature, which are intelligible behaviors of material things, some argue that this indicates that there is a intelligence behind the laws of nature, because there's no inherent reason why gravity or the law of thermodynamics should exist. There's no inherent reason why these regular behaviors, why there should be laws. Why don't we have a universe that behaves chaotically? So even Einstein, in some of his letters, wrote that one of the miracles of the universe is that there are laws of nature. He said we should expect a chaotic universe. We shouldn't expect this orderly universe. So some have reasoned that because you have order in nature, that indicates that the creator, the unconditioned reality, has intellect, knowledge, and wisdom. Others have looked to the various powers within nature. There's a lot of power within the cosmos, from stars and black holes and so on. And if there's power within the cosmos, the source of that power would be the creator. Therefore, the unconditioned reality is powerful. We also notice, some people argue, that some conditioned realities or some contingent possibilities actually come into existence and many others do not. It's as if some outcomes are being willed over others, and at the cosmic level, some argue that that means the unconditioned reality has will. Another argument, again, these are all separate arguments. They're not part of this main argument. So these are adjunct arguments. Some have argued that the existence, the human beings, we seem to intuit the idea that there are some objective values that we live by. There are some things, some values that seem to be true, no matter how many people agree with it or not. So some have argued that if there are objective values, right, mind-independent moral values or virtues like compassion, justice, truth, goodness, that for these values to be truly objective, they have to be grounded in a transcendent reality. And some have argued that that transcendent reality is the unconditioned reality. So the unconditioned reality, the creator, is the ground of values like goodness, truth, justice, and so on. So these are additional arguments that people have offered. There's another type of argument that's used by more Aristotelian type philosophers. So this is an additional argument. It basically says that since this unconditioned reality is the cause of everything, right? Everything that exists. Therefore, the powers and the virtues, the qualities that we see in conditioned reality, the qualities we see in the universe, including humans, they are also present in the unconditioned reality. The unconditioned reality has to include qualities like knowledge, intellect, goodness, consciousness, and so forth. So Edward Feser, who's written about this, he's a philosopher, he has said that there's this Aristotelian idea that a cause cannot give what it does not have. So if this unconditioned reality truly is the cause of everything that exists, it's also the cause of justice. It's also the cause of intellect. It's also the cause of goodness. It's also the cause of compassion. And therefore, these qualities, if they exist in the effects, they have to also exist in the cause in some form. And we don't really know what that form is. So Edward Feser argues that the unmoved mover, as the source of all change, is the source of things coming to have the attributes they have. Hence, he has these attributes eminently, if not formally. This includes every power, so he is all powerful. It also includes intellect and will that humans possess, so he must be said to have intellect and will. So let me just say that people offer additional arguments, reasoning from the features of creation, to tell us, to sort of propose that the creator, the unconditioned reality, has these qualities. But there's a big debate over in what sense does the unconditioned reality have these qualities? And in the next two lectures that I do for you, you'll see that Christians and Muslims amongst themselves completely disagree on the nature of divine attributes. There's a huge disagreement on what that really means. So it can get quite complicated. But I just wanted you to know. So even if you ignore these additional things, a simple, unbounded, single, immaterial, eternal, continuous creator, unconditioned reality, that already, you already have the concept of God there. I think you already have it. And certainly when you bring in these attributes, now we're certainly talking about the concept of God. The unconditioned reality is what theologians and religious philosophers call God. Now, is it what common believers think about God? Probably not, but that's okay, because even within each religion, there are many different understandings of what God is. So there's certainly a species, a subset of theistic belief in God that corresponds to this concept of the unconditioned reality, which, as we've talked about today, can be grounded through some philosophical arguments. Now, based on what I shared, let's go back to that first slide where we had all these reasons against the existence of God. And I think based on what I've presented, one could easily respond to these. Now, at the end of the day, although I've shared two arguments with you, are they effective? I mean, people have different views on this. Each person has to decide for themselves whether these are good arguments or not. I showed only two arguments. There are dozens of arguments for the existence of God. I only showed two. And the two that I showed, there are many intelligent, rational, thinking people, philosophers, scientists, academics, who think they're not good arguments. There are many people who are not persuaded by these arguments, and that's fine. There's many people who are persuaded by these arguments. So you'll find people on both sides. I think, though, my goal here today was not to prove to you whether the arguments are good or bad. I think everybody should make their own decision on that. But my goal was to present the arguments cogently. My goal was to make the arguments understandable, and whatever I present from any religious tradition, I try to present the best version of it. I don't try to present a weak version of it. So that's what I try to do, and I think drawing based on what was said, one could respond to these common objections, and here's what it would be, right, based on what was said. So, belief in the existence of God is a matter of blind faith. Well, I mean, historically, there are centuries of philosophical arguments for the existence of God. Are they good arguments? That really depends on what you think. Somebody could say they're bad arguments, but it's certainly not a matter of blind faith for many people. God cannot be scientifically proven. I think that's true. I think God cannot be scientifically proven. I think there are many things that can't be scientifically proven that we take as true. The scientific method also cannot be scientifically proven. With so much evil and suffering in the world, God does not exist. I think that this objection has a lot of emotional force, but it does not negate the contingency of things. Furthermore, some have said that if you want to talk about evil as an objective thing and good as an objective value, one could argue from the objectivity of good and evil that there has to be a transcendent ground for that value, which could be God for some people. Quantum physics shows some things are uncaused. Not exactly true. In quantum physics, they have, for example, talked about there are virtual particles that pop into existence, but they don't come out of nothing. They come out of a quantum field. They depend on quantum fields. And there are many events in quantum physics that cannot be determined, like they can't be predicted. So those are indeterminate. This is all called indeterminism, but that does not mean uncaused, right? Indeterminate and uncaused they're not the same thing conceptually. If everything has a cause, who caused God? That's very interesting. Now here's the thing. If God is defined as a necessary being or an unconditioned reality, then the necessary being is uncaused. So by definition, there cannot be a cause. If, however, someone does not define God as the necessary being, if there's a different definition of God, then it could be that God was caused by the necessary being. So that's an interesting idea. Stephen Hawking's objection that the universe, that gravity creates the universe or the universe created itself. So here's the problem. If there's no universe, you don't really have gravity. Gravity and other laws of physics, they're not actual entities, right? They're not actual powers. Laws of nature are descriptions of how material things behave. That's how I and many people understand laws. So you can't have laws unless there's already things that are obeying the laws. Now, the universe can't create itself, I would say, from nothing, because firstly, something cannot exist before it exists. I can't create myself. If I created myself, I have to already exist to create myself. Furthermore, some will argue, as I mentioned, that the law-like behavior of material things indicates a guiding intelligence. So some could say that, okay, even if gravity is this ultimate law that has always been here, why does it exist? Why is there law-like behavior like gravity? There's no inherent reason why material things should obey any laws. So some would argue, I'm not saying I would argue it, but some would argue that the law-like behavior of matter is due to the fact that there is a guiding cosmic intellect causing that behavior to happen. So the laws of nature arguments can work both ways. Somebody has said, if the universe is eternal and infinite in the past, so there's no Big Bang, there's no need to posit a God. Good objection, but a temporally infinite universe is still contingent, in a sense. Why? Well, the universe is this collection of physical reality, right? Matter, energy, all these processes. Like that's what we call the universe, and it's constantly changing. It has dimensions, spatial dimensions. There's parts of the universe are finite. Even if it always existed, the argument from contingent existence or conditioned realities, the argument still stands, because at even if this existence is every moment, there's an infinite amount of time. At every slice of time, there's a hierarchy of conditioned realities and dependence. And at every slice of time, the chain of conditioned realities depends on the unconditioned reality. So you actually sort of need it more. The argument becomes stronger if the universe is infinite. Someone has said there's no time before the Big Bang, so there's no possible way for God to create the universe. Again, the two arguments I shared here are not dependent on the Big Bang. We don't need a Big Bang. The Big Bang is irrelevant. But even if there is a Big Bang, let's say time began 13 billion years ago. The unconditioned reality, the necessary being, transcends time. It's creating, it's sustaining everything beyond time. So the causal activity of the unconditioned reality is simultaneous with the existence of conditioned realities. And that there's an earlier slide where I explained that. So you guys can check that out. So again, were these arguments effective? I don't know. I think one has to really go back and examine the assumptions made for both of these arguments. And those assumptions are this. There's an assumption made that contingent existence or conditioned realities depend on causes or other realities. So the assumption being made is this idea of causation. That is the key assumption, that a contingent thing depends on a cause to exist. That's the assumption. Now, what's an objection against this against the assumption? Well, Immanuel Kant, I think he made the argument. He once said that causation only applies in the physical world, and it does not apply beyond the physical, beyond nature. That's what Kant said. That was his objection. So others have used that too. I don't think it's a good objection, because if you say the causation only exists in the natural world and it doesn't exist beyond the natural world, how could you know that? How could we know that causation doesn't operate outside the natural world? Rather, a better strategy would be to say, let's make no assumption on whether there is causation beyond the natural world or not. Let's not even go there. Rather, if one finds that the natural world itself is contingent, then it depends on something beyond the natural world, and therefore causation is in play. So that's the thing. This argument, it doesn't really assume universal causation at all. In fact, the argument itself, until the end, it never really makes a distinction between the physical and the non-physical world. That distinction really only comes at the end of the argument. So at the end of the day, another, like the key question, like some of, whether you agree